The topic of reader sensitivity might be intuitive to you. It was to me when I came across the only account of it I've ever seen, in an obscure book by a magazine writer from the early 1980s. The title, How to Write Like a Pro, would likely have evoked a healthy dose of derisive laughter from my MFA colleagues if they'd ever caught me reading it, especially since the author, Barry Tarshis, wasn't exactly Joan Didion, John McPhee, or Don DeLillo. He was a freelance magazine writer who wrote articles about tennis, but damned if he didn't know exactly what he was talking about. Reader sensitivity was something I'd figured out implicitly, but Tarshis's lessons on this topic were exactly on point, and when I started teaching writing to student writers, I knew that this skill was not intuitive to all writers and could be learned. More importantly, reader sensitivity definitely needed to be learned by the writers who didn't practice it intuitively. It's critical to practice if you want to keep your readers reading. The telepathic art, as we've spoken about it here, is like the metaphor I used in the last lesson, a dance. And as a writer, you must lead the dance. Just like in dancing, you can dance with a partner or you can dance alone. If you're leading, you must have a sense of where your partner is in order to take them anywhere. If you don't understand this, you're going to be dancing alone, as in no readers. You don't want to dance with a partner who doesn't care whether you're there, and neither does anyone else. You need to get doubly telepathic if you want to lead this dance. You must know what your reader is thinking. That might sound impossible, but it's really just about being sensitive to what thoughts your words are putting into your reader's head. Remember, you're leading, so if you're in control of the words you're putting on the page, you should have an idea of what a reader of those words is thinking. Tarshis puts it like this. I define reader sensitivity as an ongoing awareness of how your readers are processing and reacting to what you've written. It's being able to put yourself in the reader's shoes. It's sensing when the word you've used may not be expressing as clearly as it should the idea or image you're trying to get across. It's sensing when an idea or image you've given your reader is likely to have created a question in the reader's mind, which you must quickly answer. It's sensing when you need to beef up an idea with added details so that your reader will better grasp the importance of the idea. And it's being able to sense when your reader may be getting bored or possibly angry, and knowing what to do to eliminate the boredom or anger. Essentially, reader sensitivity is the practice of anticipating a reader's reaction and writing with this reaction in mind. Far too many writers of all levels forget that writing is an inherently social act. It is a conversation. And you wouldn't just keep talking through your listener's confusion if you were in the room with her. When you're talking, you actually use phrases linguists call faddics to check for understanding and fill in empty spaces, as a way to be sure that your listener is following along. You know what I'm saying? And since the reader isn't in the room with you when you're writing, you need to develop a sense for how an average reader will follow your lead. This is a process that takes place at the sentence level, which is why I mention it here. You have to write good sentences, yes, but they also need to connect to one another through the ideas they convey. I'll show you what I mean. Here's Norman MacLean again, talking about fly fishing. Although I have a warm personal feeling for the canyon, it is not an ideal place for me to fish. It puts a premium on being able to cast for distance, and yet most of the time there are cliffs or trees right behind the fisherman, so he has to keep all his line in front of him. It's like a baseball pitcher being deprived of his windup, and it forces the fly fisherman into what is called a roll cast, a hard cast to get distance without throwing any line behind him, and then he has to develop enough power from a short arc to shoot it out across the water. Norman is tightly controlling the reader's thoughts here. He begins by talking about a canyon where his brother and he are going to fish. He finishes the first sentence by stating, "It is not an ideal place for me to fish." A reader will get through this statement not merely understanding that it's not an ideal place for Norman to fish, but also thinking, "Why not, Norman?" And Norman knows this, so he answers. It puts a premium on being able to cast for distance. Then Norman goes on to explain why it's difficult to cast for distance in the canyon. There are cliffs and trees right behind him. Then he offers an analogy to make it clearer. It's like a baseball pitcher being deprived of his windup. And a reader might be thinking, so what does a fly fisherman without a windup do? Norman answers, It forces the fly fisherman into what is called a roll cast, and before the reader even has time to think, "What's a roll cast?" Norman lets the reader know. A hard cast to get distance without throwing any line behind him. This is reader sensitivity done well. Norman never lets the reader's thoughts get away from his narrator. He's leading the dance every step of the way. This might be something you do intuitively. Some writers, as I mentioned earlier, just seem to have this important piece built into their prose from day one. Others must learn it. Tarshish uses the analogy of his colleague who gives clear and precise directions, a skill people once needed before the days of GPS. And it's a lot like giving directions. You need to know what ideas or images your reader is thinking about and also anticipate the turns in the road that might throw them slightly off track. You also must avoid omitting crucial steps. That could throw your reader entirely off track. What does that look like? Well, imagine what Norman's paragraph above might have looked like if he didn't answer the questions the text raised. It might look something like this. Although I have a warm personal feeling for the canyon, it is not an ideal place for me to fish. There are always eagles, elk, and grizzlies in the canyon, but they don't usually get close enough to take a decent picture. It puts a premium on being able to cast for distance, and yet most of the time there are cliffs or trees right behind the fishermen. Sometimes it is better to use 12-pound line because the fish in the canyon are big, tough fighters. It's difficult to hook anything here if you don't know how to roll cast. Now, there's nothing grammatically wrong with the passage I just read, and none of the sentences are terrible or difficult to understand, but there's also no sense of reader sensitivity. I'm not answering the questions the sentences raise. I'm going off track and adding non sequiturs, information that doesn't follow naturally from each previous point. So what's the key difference between what I've done in the paragraph above and what Norman did? Tarshish emphasizes the importance of the reader's focus. He puts it like this. When I talk about the reader's focus, I am talking mainly about whatever idea, image, or point the reader's mind happens to be resting on whenever a sentence ends. In other words, where your reader is. If your intention is to move your reader somewhere else, introduce a new point, etc., you do your reader a valuable service by using that focal point as the connecting link to the next idea or image you're introducing. It's a lot like passing a baton in a relay race. In other words, when you end a sentence by conveying to the reader that the fish in this canyon are tough fighters, the next sentence should convey something about this point. Whether you're comparing them to the fish in other spots on the river, or mentioning what species of fish they are that makes them so tough. Something should let your reader know why these fish are tough fighters, because the reader is already moving in that direction. Moving your reader elsewhere is akin to jerking your dance partner back across the floor by the wrist, with no warning. They're not going to tolerate such treatment for long. We'll continue this discussion of reader sensitivity as these lessons on sentences progress. This is merely an introduction to the concept, which I'll refer to from time to time. I could certainly say more about the subject, but I'll be sensitive to the fact that some writers already do this intuitively, and that for those who don't and need more on this topic, Tarshish's clear, detailed, and useful work on the matter can still be had. Writing with the reader's thoughts in your mind may not be intuitive to you. But if your sentences are grammatically correct, and your stories are interesting, and your readers still aren't following along to the very end, then reader sensitivity may be an area you need to focus more on. If you're going to lead this kind of dance, better make it a smooth one. If you want to be the type of writer readers are lining up to dance with, be sensitive. Try not to step on their toes or jerk them by the wrist. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, now.